My name is Raymond Lauda. I'm on the staff of Revolution Books, and I want to give everyone a warm welcome to this, Revolution Books, the political, intellectual, and cultural center of a movement for an actual revolution. So again, welcome. And I encourage all of you to spend time at the store after the program to get to know the store better, the people on the staff. And I do want to say this, that if you are outraged by the escalating white supremacy, the attacks on immigrants, the murder yet again of an unarmed black youth in Memphis that happened last week, what happened to Laylene, this transgender woman found dead at Rikers Island. If you're outraged by that, you are in the right place. If you find this intolerable and want to see an end to this, to these injustices and to these horrors, then you're in the right place. If you yearn for a world in which human beings can truly flourish, free from exploitation and oppression, then you're in the right place here at Revolution Books. And if you have the poetic spirit, you are at the right place at Revolution Books. So I'll have more to say about the bookstore and your support for this bookstore later in the program. Tonight, we're very excited to have David Blight with us. David is a professor of history at Yale University. He has written extensively on the Civil War. He is the author of several editions of the second volume of Frederick Douglass's Autobiography. He has written a major work entitled Race and Reunion, the Civil War in the American Memory. And he has written articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and what's most relevant to tonight is that David Blight is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, and he's going to be presenting that book tonight. But let's give David a round of applause for winning the Pulitzer Prize. The format for tonight is going to be David's presentation. That'll go 35, 40 minutes. And then I want to say some more about the bookstore and your support. Then we're going to have a 10-minute conversation or so on the stage, and then we're going to open it up to you for questions, comments. We'll carry the discussion forward and then leave some time for everyone to mingle, talk with David, and get their book autographed. We have the book for sale. And tonight, we're offering a 10% discount on the book. So get it while you can at that rate. And without further ado, I want to bring David to the stage, and let's give him a warm round of applause.
Okay, we on? How's the sound in the back?
Good.
Thumbs up? Great. Thank you, Raymond. Thank you to the staff of Revolution Books, and thank you all for coming out. This is a special thrill. I've been to all kinds of sites with this book for 8 months now. Since October, there's barely been a week that I haven't been somewhere talking about the book. But I haven't been to Revolution Books yet. The one here or the one in Berkeley. And I went to Berkeley for a book festival, and Revolution Books had a big table there, but they did. And it was an amazing book festival, by the way. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of this book, the 6 big themes and why I wrote it. But I want to place you somewhere too. Raymond mentioned outrage. Yeah, and there's been so many times in recent years when we've wondered, so where is the outrage? And you just made me think that, in a sense, Douglass spent a career working with outrage, working to create outrage, working to control his outrage. The fact that he lived through this 77-year epic life has something to do with the fact that he could control his outrage. Otherwise, he might have been dead. But I want to start with a quick quotation, not from Douglass, but from one source from which he gained, believe it or not, his radicalism. It's from the first chapter of the book of Jeremiah. Behold, I have put my words in your mouth to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, but to build and to plant. Now, if you heard that, it's Jeremiah, the Hebrew prophet. It's the great Jeremiah of the warnings, saying, actually, he's remembering the voice he claimed of God inspiring him to destroy and to build, to overthrow and then to recreate. Now, Douglass became a creature of words. He became a man of words. We wouldn't be here tonight if it weren't for his words. He never really attained any significant other kind of power than the power and the weapon of words. He gained 3 major appointments from the federal government after the Civil War. They were, in 2 cases, bureaucratic appointments, although they came with a salary, which he'd never had before. And he was the U.S. ambassador to Haiti as well. That's a very significant appointment. Hey, hey, hey. Where's my French? It's pretty non-existent. But anyway, he never attained any particular office. He never created any particular institution, except his newspaper that he edited for 16 years. He was a great journalist. He didn't leave a college. He didn't build a college like Booker T. Washington did. He didn't help create the NAACP like Du Bois did. But he left a testimony. He left millions of words. As a speaker, but I've argued, and I argue all over this book, particularly as a writer. We tend to think of Douglass as an orator, the great orator, the sermonizer, and he was. But at the end of the day, he was a writer. He wrote 1,200 pages of autobiography. He never stopped writing his own story, which we can come back to in a minute. Why does one write about himself so much? And it's both a precious thing if you're his biographer, but it's also a problem. Because the autobiographer is always there in your way as a biographer. He's trying to impose a story on you. He wrote hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of short-form political editorials in his newspapers and other people's newspapers. He mastered that form. He wrote one novella in 1852 called The Heroic Slave. He tried fiction. He should have done even more fiction. He'd have gotten much better at it if he'd have stayed with fiction. He wrote poetry too, quite a lot of it. It actually wasn't his best form. He probably should have kept most of it in the drawer, which is what most of us do with our poetry. But he was a prose poet. And then, of course, he wrote the thousands of speeches, literally thousands of speeches. Every major Douglass speech exists in a text form. He didn't just go into halls and sermonize and blow out the lights. He had a text for every major speech. We could name any of the major speeches of Douglass's life. They all exist in text. He wrote it down first. He was a creature of words. He learned words first from the Bible. He learned words first from the King James language of the Bible. The way he got language in his head, whether he understood all those Old Testament stories or not, does anybody understand all those Old Testament stories when you first read them or the 100th time you read them? Noah's Ark, for God's sake. Although he made tremendous use of Noah's Ark as a kind of revolutionary story. I'll show you that in a second. He got language in his head when he was still a slave, when he's a 10 and 12, actually when he's an 8, 9, 10, and 11, 12-year-old kid. First from his mistress, Sophia Auld, then from his playmates in the streets of Baltimore, these little white kids who were all Irish and German immigrants but weren't old enough to learn their racism yet, and they treated him mostly like an equal. And then he learned words from sitting with an old black preacher whose name was Charles Lawson, a guy in Baltimore who was partly literate but not fully literate, but he was a Bible fanatic. And he loved the stories of the Bible. By day he drove a cart, he was a drayman, to try to make a few bucks. But whenever he had time, and whenever this kid, Fred Bailey, from about age 12 to 14, could be harnessed, he sat him down and he had Bailey, who becomes Douglass, read out loud with him. Read the Bible out loud, hour after hour after hour after hour. That's how he got language in his head. And he especially became so fond of the Old Testament Hebrew prophets, of their storytelling. Douglass was a master storyteller. He learned that from biblical story. So, Jeremiah to begin with. Anyway, it's been said many times that Douglass may have been, or probably was, the most photographed American of the 19th century. I just want to say a couple of things about that. There's a marvelous book that's been out 2 or 3 years now called Picturing Frederick Douglass, where the 3 intrepid editors went all over the country, as well as in the UK, although they didn't find any in the UK. And they have something like 162 extant photographs of Douglass reprinted in that book. If you don't have it, I recommend you get it. It looks like a coffee table book, but it's much more than that. Why was Douglass photographed so many times? There are lots of answers. One is, well, just look at him. The man is stunning. When he was young, as he got older, young, I should have had that in the other order. This is Douglass by the early 1850s. I mean, that guy dressed with his, with his white shirts and his frock coats, with that careful part in that hair, as it's already beginning to get a little silver up there on top. And when he opened his mouth with that baritone voice, and pretty soon you weren't even thinking about the voice or what he looked like, you were listening to the metaphors, you were listening to the story, you were listening to the critique, whether it was of the government or if it was of the church or whatever. This is the photograph he used on the cover of My Bondage and My Freedom, his second autobiography, not on the cover, in the frontispiece of his second autobiography in 1855. And this photo, one of my favorites, and had never been used in any book anywhere until I put it on the cover of my edition of Bondage and Freedom, was from about 1857 or 58. They found it in a museum in Kansas City, a place called the Nelson Atkins Museum. They had apparently owned it for years and had never displayed it. Now, how could you not display this photo? Now, okay, that's one reason he was photographed so much. He was beautiful. But perhaps even more important, he cultivated photographers. He cultivated the art of photography. He was fascinated with this modern technology that could recreate the human image. And he went and found photographers, and eventually he had 2 or 3 favorite ones. There were certain photographers that shot him like 7, 8, 9, and 10 times each, because he kept going back to them. If you didn't like this profile, he'd have you do this profile, straight on, looking back. Never smiling, yes, but that's partly because you had to sit so long for 19th century photographs. People always ask, why didn't he smile more? Why didn't Lincoln smile more? There's one photo late in life where Douglass does, you can tell he's been smiling at least. He was smiling. But he cultivated this, and Just look and think why. In a century when black men weren't supposed to be beautiful, well-dressed, articulate, educated. Well, he wasn't formally educated, but he was educated. Brilliant. He used photography to say, look at me. Look who I am. I'm not what you think black men are. I'm not what you think black people are supposed to be. And he used his photographs to tell that story. There's a third reason he's so photographed, and maybe the most photographed, although there's a pushback now from the Ulysses Grant scholars. There's been a lot of recent books on Grant, as any bookstore manager knows, and they may be coming up with more photos of Grant. I don't know. Who cares? You know, who's the most? And Mark Twain is close too, but Twain lived to 1910, so that doesn't count. I mean, the other reason is he traveled so widely. I speculate in the book that he may have been the most traveled American of the 19th century. I mean, no one can count it. I mean, I can't measure it and I can't prove it. But I'm guessing he may have traveled more miles on land and sea than any other American. Again, the only one who might have bested him would be Mark Twain. But Twain cheated because he went to Asia. And Douglass didn't get to go to Asia. And since he traveled everywhere he would go, the local photographer wanted to photograph him. You know, in tiny towns, in Indiana, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, all over the country. If he went to a town to speak, if there was a photographer, he got invited to the studio, and he almost always went. One of my favorites is this one. This was taken in January 1863, note the date, in Hillsdale, Michigan, which is a very small town. It has a small college. It had a small college then that was created just before the Civil War. He sat in a studio for this photograph. This photograph was taken 3 weeks after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and Douglass did what he always did. If there was a big change, a big pivot in history, a big event, a catastrophe, a tragedy, or whatever, a big turn in ideological debate, Douglass went to his desk, wrote a new speech, and took it on the road. He did this over and over and over. And the speech he's out in Michigan giving, when he had this photo taken, was called The Proclamation and the Negro Army. And among other things he said in that speech, which by the way was the speech where he began to work out all of his arguments for recruiting black soldiers. And by that spring, he is out on the circuit recruiting young men for the 54th Massachusetts Regiment being formed in Massachusetts, 2 of whom were his 2 sons. But it's in that speech, January 63, where he said, among other things, he said, the proclamation frees the white Confederate soldier, the proclamation frees the white Union soldier, the proclamation frees the slave, the proclamation frees the black soldier, the proclamation frees everybody. Which was Douglass's way of saying emancipation now, not just that document, but emancipation has the capacity, has the chance to free the entire country from itself. To put the United States, if it can survive this war, and it's only still in the middle of the war, if it can survive this war, it can put the United States on a course to becoming a second, new, different, better, honest country. All right, enough of the image. Let's put that 57 shot back. Although I love the old Douglass. Let's leave him up there for a while. I wanted the old Douglass on the cover because I'm using the word prophet in the title. And that's not the one I actually wanted. The one I actually wanted is the end paper in the rear of the book. It's 1894, he's 76. It's just months before he dies. And man, there's a Moses in that photo. There's a, I don't know. The ages are in him. And I wanted it until my publisher showed me this cover and I said, okay. Because it was so beautiful. So anyway, all right, enough. I always get asked about the photos, so I thought I'd at least express that. Now, just a quick thing too. The primary reason I wrote this new biography of Douglass, and it wasn't because I just decided at some point in my career, time to write a big new biography of Frederick Douglass. No, that is not the way it usually happened. I did my first book in the late 1980s, which is my dissertation out of graduate school on Douglass. It was a fairly small book, small compared to this monster, on the meaning of the Civil War and Douglass's life and thought. I edited editions of his first two autobiographies. I wrote essays on Douglass. I put the Columbian Order back in print in the 1990s. The book about oratory that he discovered when he was 12 years old, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I had Douglass pretty well out of my life. I mean, he's part of every other book I ever wrote, but he was gone. Until I went to Savannah, Georgia, 12 years ago now, to give a talk to middle school and high school teachers, which I've done many, many times, about Douglass's autobiographies, because people teach it. Some of you do. The narrative. And as I arrived, my host, which was the Georgia Historical Society, said, there's a local gentleman here in town who would like to meet you and have lunch. He's a collector. And I said probably something like, okay. But that day, and to make a long story short, that day I met the most extraordinary man. Some of you may know Walter. His name is Walter Evans. He has spent a lot of time here in Harlem and all over New York, particularly for his art collecting. Walter is an African-American retired surgeon who made a very good living. But he grew up in segregated Savannah. He went north for his higher education. He went to Howard University in D.C. as an undergrad. He went to the University of Michigan Medical School, and then he practiced in Detroit for over 30 years as a general surgeon. And he started collecting African-American rare books, manuscripts, and art in the 1970s, and then in the 80s. In fact, his art collection is more famous and more important than anything else he owns. But that day, he took me over to his house, which is a big, beautiful brownstone in Savannah, and on his dining room table, he got out a major portion of his Douglass collection. And it was just one of those moments you have as a historian where you walk away kind of shivering, like, oh God, you know. Oh God, in part because what am I going to do? If I don't write this new biography of Douglass, somebody else will. And I don't want them to. And again, the collection, the core of the collection that made this new book possible are about 10 very large family scrapbooks that were kept by Douglass's sons during the last 30 or really 35 years of their father's life. They're huge. They include thousands of newspaper clippings from all over the United States, from odd towns and newspapers that you could never otherwise locate today, even with, you know, digitization of old newspapers. No way you're going to find all of it. It also has a great deal of family material, letters. Letters between one of Douglass's sons and his sweetheart during the war, letters between the children when they became adults, letters between sons and their father, a lot of family documents about births and deaths and so on and so on. And I could go on and on. The scrapbooks also included, and this was pure gold when I saw it. And I didn't even know about these two things until probably the third time I went down there to work on it. It included 2 handwritten narratives by 2 of Douglass's sons with titles like Growing Up in the Douglass Household. And they're about 15-page handwritten stories about what it was like growing up Douglass's son. And there's a great deal in those little narratives about their mother, which was so important because Anna Douglass, as some of you probably know, Douglass's first wife and his wife of 44 years, who followed him out of slavery with the same bravery he had, remained illiterate all of her life. And we don't have a lot to work on to understand Douglass's wife. So you got to get at her by other means. And these 2 narratives by 2 of her sons were just priceless because they talked a lot about their mother. That was breathtaking. And on I could go. The stuff that I found in these clippings was just incredible. Texture. If you're a biographer and you're trying to tell the story of somebody's life, you're trying to recreate the moments of a person's life, the situation of a person's life, you need texture. You need people to say what it was like that day, what it looked like that day, what his voice sounded like, what he looked like. And I found piles of this kind of stuff. So anyway, it took me some months to decide that, yeah, I'm going to do this, but had I not encountered Walter Evans's extraordinary collection, I never would have done this book. So all praise to Walter Evans, and some of you, if you have the book, you may note it is dedicated to Walter and Linda Evans. I spent 4 or 5 spring breaks from Yale in Savannah. I spent many other weeks at different times down there. That's the coolest archive I've ever worked in. On somebody's dining room table? It's not fair. They only had 2 rules for me, by the way. One was never come before 8 a.m., which was fine. And the other was never put your coffee cup on the same table with the documents, and I didn't. Now, and by the way, we've been working assiduously at Yale for several years now to get Walter to sell this Douglass collection to the Beinecke Library at Yale, which has a tremendous collection of African American literature and history. And as yet, he has not taken their offer, their price, and he's holding out for more money. It's ridiculous, but we're going to get it somehow. Schomburg will want it too, but Walter's a businessman. He's a tough businessman, and I can warn you on that. Anyway, I could tell you more about Walter all night. And I want to say, too, when I went to this luncheon for the Pulitzer Prizes, Walter came up to New York, and Walter was there with me, so it was his celebration as much as mine. All right, how do you though, impose order? Let me just take you through my 6 big themes of the book, and then we can have at it. How do you impose order on a life? And if someone is going to write your life someday, when you're old enough for someone to write about your life, how will they organize it? And what have you left for them to work with? People you know in your life. If you were to write your mother's life, or write your brother's life, how would you organize it? In this case, you're talking about a person who became an extraordinary public person. This extraordinary public figure, a voice in the world. The most important African American man of letters in the world in the 19th century. Creature of language, creature of words. But he's born in 1818, out in a backwater of the American Slave Society along a horseshoe bend in the Tuckahoe River, way out on the eastern shore of Maryland. Nowhere. Really. He's nobody from nowhere at first. He's Fred Bailey. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, and I couldn't find a way to explain why his slave mother, Harriet Bailey, gave him all those names. Think about it. Augustus? Now, Douglass claimed his mother was literate. And they have no reason to not believe him. Is she choosing a Roman emperor? Washington? Is it George? I don't know. But he's Fred Bailey. He's nobody from nowhere. He's born before steamboats are on American rivers. He's born before the railroad, before the telegraph, before the rotary press, which would revolutionize communication and revolutionize the possibilities of abolitionism and would revolutionize his career. He became a journalist. That rotary press made possible first the weekly newspaper, then the daily newspaper. And God, did he exploit it. And boy, did he love steamships. And he traveled probably more miles on railroads than any other American. But he's going to live all the way to 1895 to a whole new kind of modernity. He's going to live to the age of light bulbs, the first telephones, the first internal combustion engines, and the first phonograph. He could have been recorded, his voice, but so far as we know, he never was, which is astonishing if you think about it. This greatest voice of the 19th century, why didn't somebody sit him down in 1894? Well, they didn't know he was going to die, for one thing, but why didn't somebody sit him down and record that voice? And I don't think he was ever recorded, because I have a letter that he wrote about 3 months before he dies. He goes to dinner at a man's house named Anderson in Washington, D.C., and a lovely evening, and he writes a thank you note for the dinner. But what he really wrote about in the letter at length is that this man Anderson had played a phonograph for him, had played a recording of a friend of Douglass's, a black minister named Weirs. The voice had been recorded. And Douglass goes back and writes this letter in which he goes bonkers over this amazing new invention. He calls it a divine invention. And he ends the letter by saying, "Is it true and possible the human voice could live forever?" Wow. He's talking about himself there. And I don't think he writes that letter if he'd ever been recorded. So, anyway, this life traverses most of the 19th century. But in the middle of it, of course, is this epic American story, this great pivot of American history: slavery, the coming of the Civil War, the fighting of the war, emancipation of 4 million slaves, the Reconstruction era, the retreat from Reconstruction, the demise of Reconstruction, the beginnings of the Jim Crow era, and all the way up into the worst lynching years of the 1890s. He lives that entire story. How do you impose order on it? I don't know, you guess, and you hope, and you wish, and you try. Here are the 6 big themes in the book, and I've already really signaled 2 of them, 3 of them actually, so I can go quickly. The first is words. Throughout the book, I emphasize how this is this man is a person of words. Even when I'm developing his earliest years as a slave, I'm relying a lot on his autobiographies, of course, which are uncannily accurate in their details. We know that from various kinds of research. When he's embellishing things and telling stories about it, there are elements you can't verify. But he is a writer who can represent himself, who can create a situation through a metaphor, who can take you to a place because he's so good at creating scenes. Now, how he came by this ability to write so young is partly explainable and part mystery. Words, and an amazing facility with words. Throughout the book, words are in some ways the primary character. In fact, at one point I asked my editor at Simon & Schuster if I could use a certain title on the book. I said I wanted to call the book Frederick Douglass, Biography of a Voice. And I have a great editor named Tom Bender, and Tom said, "Nope, can't have that title. Too literary. You'll lose your audience." I don't know. I don't know if he was right or not, but I agreed. Second big theme is the autobiographies. He wrote 3 of them, and then he revised the 3rd one another time. So in effect, there are 4 versions. The first one in 1845, the narrative. The second one 10 years later in 1855, My Bondage and My Freedom, which is his long-form masterpiece, and a much more political autobiography that he writes in his 30s, in the middle of the 1850s, in the middle of the crisis, the political crisis over slavery and its expansion into the West. And in that autobiography, we see a new Douglass, a politicized Douglass, a Douglass engaged with politics, a Douglass engaged with law, a Douglass engaged with the Constitution, and a Douglass shouldering up to the possible uses of revolutionary violence. And he writes a 3rd autobiography in 1882, when he's the old man kind of summing up his life and name-dropping all the famous people he's known, but also laying down all kinds of wonderful detail about the whole middle of his life that we wouldn't otherwise know without that. And then he revised that again in 1891. In other words, this is somebody who never stopped writing his own story. So, if you're the biographer on this guy, you have to treat the autobiographies as both a source And they are a source. There's no bomb gonna go off. That's all right. You're forgiven. It's deep in that bag. There it is. All right. You have to treat autobiographies as both the source and a subject. It's your source. It gives you all kinds of information. But it's also your subject in the sense that you have to explain, why does this guy keep writing about himself? Why is it that he feels like he only has one great story to tell? I mean, he tells lots of great stories. Is it because he comes to believe he is the literary representative of Black America? There are plenty of others in his lifetime, but he was the best. Is it because he feels like he is the literary representative of his people and he has to keep representing them? Is it because he has to keep telling the world, here's my story, you should know it, and there are thousands of others like me, maybe they can't quite write it yet, millions of others like me? Or is it because, like every other memoirist, every other great autobiographer, he was always trying to figure out, who the hell am I? Don't forget, he was born from slave mother Harriet Bailey, who he really barely ever knew. He saw her last when he was 6 years old, but he had really no vivid memory of her. He had to invent memories of his mother. And he never did know who his father was, although he knew his father was white and probably one of his two owners, but he didn't even know that. And he spent an incredible amount of energy and time in his life trying to figure out who his father was. I can tell you lots of stories about that. Some of us are still trying to figure out who his father was, and there's now even an effort to do DNA testing with surviving descendants of the Auld family to at least try to eliminate the Aulds from the game of who is Mr. D's father. But this was a man who did not know he's an orphan. Orphans are always looking for, who am I? And he's really looking for who am I, because he's born out there. If you've ever been to the Chesapeake Bay, if you go to the Eastern Shore, talk to me. I can tell you where to go to find Douglass. But he's born out there on the Eastern Shore, in nowhere. But he comes to here, and for here, eventually, was a big house on a hill in Washington, D.C., which he purchases in 1878 called Cedar Hill. And he ends up with a job down there in the City Hall of Washington, D.C. as the Marshal of the District of Columbia, the Recorder of Deeds of the District of Columbia, and eventually U.S. Ambassador to Haiti. How did I get from there to here? Is a question he's always trying to figure out. And God, can you sense that? He made several visits back to the Eastern Shore after the war for various reasons. One of them was to go to Thomas Auld, his owner, former owner, on his deathbed, Auld's deathbed, and just literally ask him, are you my father? He didn't get a yes. It's one of the reasons I don't think Auld was the father, but I can't prove it. But on that same visit, he went over to Easton, which is where he spent a lot of time as a slave boy. He spoke at 2 black churches in that town. And at the end of the day, he got a carriage driver to take him out to the bend in the Tuckahoe. It was only like 2 miles east of town. And he went down to the little ravine by the river where he remembered where his Grandma Betsy's cabin was, which he believed is where he was born. He got on his hands and knees on a cold, late November day. He scooped up soil in his hands. He put the soil in a bag, and he took it back to Washington with him. Who am I? Where am I from? And I have good connections and friends now. The National Park Service runs Cedar Hill, the house in Washington. And Kamal McLaren, there's my angel there, the archive. And I once asked him, Kamal, you got any old bags of dirt here? He said, what? He said, you've read Douglass on this. Remember when he kneels down to get he says, yeah, I know, no, we never found that dirt. But I thought maybe the dirt, if there's a bag of dirt somewhere, let's go check it out. Man. Anyway, Third big theme is the Bible. And I weave this throughout the book, especially after he becomes a public figure and a public lecturer at the age of 23. He's still a kid when he goes out on the circuit with the Garrisonians as an abolitionist. And I'll make this quick, but you cannot understand Douglass's rhetoric, his use of words and language, his use of storytelling, without understanding how steeped he was in the Bible. There's no major Douglass speech that isn't at least paraphrasing, if not directly quoting one of the Hebrew prophets. Sometimes 4 or 5 of them. Sometimes just paraphrases, just lines he would kind of throw in there. Sometimes whole passages, as you'll find in the famous 4th of July speech, where he quotes at length from the 137th Psalm. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, we hung our harps on the willows, and you demanded of us a song.
Yeah, I just did that thing.
Which was his brilliant way of saying to this audience, why'd you invite me here? Did you invite me here on your 4th of July to sing for you? I ain't gonna sing. I'm gonna make you hurt. And then he did for the next 20 minutes of the speech. All over Douglass's rhetoric, the great speeches especially, but also in the editorials and in Bondage and Freedom, the long autobiography, you will find this employment of biblical wisdom and biblical story. I pay far less attention in the book to Douglass's actual religious faith, because I don't think that is as easy to get to, as I do to his use of biblical story and metaphor, which, by the way, was hardly uncommon in the 19th century. And then last, and by the way, quick point. The word prophet is in the title of this book. And I had a very hard time back in the middle of writing this of getting the confidence to put that word on the title. Because it's a big word. We should never throw that word around easily. You know, that's prophetic, that's a good prophecy, and so on. People too, all the people mean by that sometimes is, well, it was predictive. But that's not what prophets are. Prophets often predict wrongly. Prophets are the wielders of language and the wielders of words and the wielders of spirit who can capture and explain the greatest traumas, the greatest catastrophes, the greatest tragedies, the greatest victories, too, in our lives in ways the rest of us can't quite capture.
Beautiful.
And when I was working on this, I had some friends who helped me. I had no formal training in theology. I took a couple, Religion 102 courses and, Old Testament 101 once upon a time. And I was raised in a Lutheran church where we had to memorize all kinds of stuff, but that doesn't count. But I have some very dear friends who are theologians, 2 or 3 in particular. I won't go into all of it, but one of them lives right up the street here. Don Schreiber, who spent a long piece of his life as president of Union Theological Seminary. He, after he got finished laughing at me when I asked him, gee, Don, what should I read on the Old Testament? You ask an Old Testament scholar what to read on the Old Testament and they laugh at you, and then they give you a bibliography. And he turned me on to Walter Brueggemann, among others, and Brueggemann helped me understand Exodus and helped me understand how Douglass was using Exodus. And then I made dear friends with a rabbi in New Haven, Jim Ponit, who used to be head rabbi of Yale University. He retired, and he and his wife used to sit in the front row of my lecture course, just hanging out in the courses. And Jim hung around, we'd have lunch, and he learned about my dilemma with Douglass's biblical language and all of that, and he said, all right, David, sit down. You got to read Robert Alter, you got to read so-and-so, you got to read so-and-so, but you especially got to read Abraham Heschel, the great Jewish theologian of the mid-20th century. And I did. I read quite a bit of Heschel, and you'll find Heschel quoted 3-4 times in the book, especially this passage. The prophet is human, says Heschel. Yet, he employs notes 1 octave too high for our ears. He experiences moments that defy our understanding. He is neither a singing saint nor a moralizing poet, but an assaulter of our minds. Often his words begin to burn where our conscience ends. an assaulter of the mind. Prophets exist to trouble us, to bother us, to worry us. Prophets are not fun to have lunch with. They trouble your mind. They make you want to run away. They make you not want to think about what they just warned you about what's coming, or what could be coming. So, and the more and more I read Heschel, and I read these passages of him describing what a prophet is, and I start nodding. Yeah, that's Douglass. And if you read Douglass at all carefully, certain speeches, the autobiographies, his editorials about politics and fugitive slaves and violence and kidnapping in the early 1850s, at times his language will just blast you between the eyes and you just wake up. And it's a passage of prose that you suddenly have to reread. That's a prophet. Last three big themes I'll do quickly. The fourth one is this kind of crooked path, and I weave this throughout the book. And by the way, this book is not a biography that has the chapter that does women, and the chapter that does the public life, and the chapter that does the private life, and the chapter that does the sons and the daughters. It's all, the best I can do anyway, woven together as one. Because we don't live our lives separating public from private you live your life in all of its dimensions every day. I mean, sometimes we have a day here and there that's just totally private, where we shut off our phone and we just vegetate, or we just put up our feet and read. For me, I don't get many of those, but no, he lived this public and private life all the time. So, fourth big theme is, how does an old radical outsider, an old radical abolitionist, always on the outside of power, beating on the doors and never quite getting in, demanding of his country this kind of change and that kind of change, insisting on an apocalyptic rending of his country, what happens if in his 40s, in the middle of his life, his cause wins? What happens if you win? What do you do with the rest of your life? At least you think you've won. And look, the Civil War was a victory. Make no mistake. 4 million slaves were freed. Yes, the country didn't make it effectively stick long term. But the Republic was reinvented in the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, in the First Civil Rights Act, in the Reconstruction Acts, even in the Ku Klux Klan Act, such as it was enforced. What does an old radical do, though, when he suddenly gets inside of power? What happens when he becomes a bureaucrat? As he grows old and he gets appointed to some office, and then another office, and then another, and suddenly he's representing the government. And we have so many cases of this in our own lifetime, many of us. Think of the great leaders of the Civil Rights Movement, so many of whom became mayors, congressmen, a couple senators. Think of John Lewis. How many now? 16 terms in Congress, I think John is in. That's 32 years in the U.S. Congress. He had hell beaten out of him over and over and over in the Civil Rights Movement. He was an outsider who became an insider. And then there's that guy from Chicago, that next generation dude, who was a community organizer, and hell, he got elected president of the United States. What happens when you actually get all this power in your hands? And you used to be an outsider. Douglass is the prototype for that, for everyone else to follow, who may or may not experience that. Fifth big theme is what I've just already expressed, but it is how you find a balance in this life between the public and the private. And the private life is a challenge in part because he virtually never wrote about it in his autobiographies. He tried not to write about it in his letters, although clearly he did in some, especially about his children. He's marries twice, once to Anna for 44 years, to Helen Pitts Douglass. He marries 16 months after Anna died, a white woman 20 years younger. The most scandalous marriage of the 19th century, bar none. when the most famous black man in the world married a white woman 20 years younger in 1884. It was for months a scandal in the black newspapers, white newspapers. He was condemned by blacks, condemned by whites, defended by some blacks, defended by some whites. The majority never defended him, and his own children weren't, to say the least, weren't happy. But Douglass was. He and Helen had a great marriage by all accounts for 11 years. The last 11 years of his life, he had a very public companion. She was very well educated, Mount Holyoke graduate, old abolitionist credentials. She'd served in contraband refugee slave camp during the Civil War, caught malaria, became a teacher. Besides, he gave her a job as one of the clerks in the Recorder of Deeds office, which is what she was doing when he married her in secret and didn't even tell his children. There's so many elements of Douglass's private life that are complicated, messy, complex. His sons and his daughter had very difficult lives. He had 21 grandchildren, at least 3 fictive siblings who adopted him and he adopted them, and a variety of other hangers-on around him in his later years, all of whom were financially dependent on him. He woke up every day with this clan of a family dependent on him. That's probably the first thing he thought about in the morning. What job has my son Charles lost this week? Can Frederick Jr. pay his mortgage on that place he bought and I told him not to? And poor Rosetta, his daughter, who had by far the best education of his 4 children, had 7 babies in 13 years with a totally ne'er-do-well jerk of a husband who always kept wandering off and abandoning her. So you got to weave that in to this great public man that tends to be what people want to hear about until you really get down with the more private side of this person's life. And last but not least, a theme that I weave throughout, at least from the moment he becomes a public man, is Douglass the intellectual, the thinker, the artist, the writer, the theorist of natural rights, the theorist of constitutionalism, particularly anti-slavery constitutionalism. Now there are no less than 3 books, there might be a 4th now, books on Douglass written by political theorists. Whole books on Douglass as a political philosopher. One of the best is by a man named Nicholas Buccola. It's called The Political Thought of Frederick Douglass. It's a brilliant book. There's a whole collection of essays by law school professors about Douglass's legal thought. Literary critics have been diving into Douglass's writings ever since the 1970s. In fact, it used to be a rite of passage in black literary criticism that you had to write an essay on chapter 1 of Douglass's narrative or you won't get hired and surely won't get tenure. Some of us have treated Douglass as a theorist, a serious thinker about the idea of memory, both personal memory and collective memory. I've written a lot about that. He was a multiple genius, whatever genius is. We throw that word around a bit too much. But this was a mind always looking to escape where he was from. And you know, when you do biography, there's always a lot at the end you just don't know, and it drives you nuts. There's the things about the person's life that they're just still too elusive. You can't get enough on that. You can't figure that out, or you just don't know enough about that relationship or that friendship. But then there's the list of things you do know. And one thing, I mean, among the many things I think I do know, is that Douglass was an intellectual sponge. And you gotta remember, again, this guy's an orphan with no formal education, never set foot in a schoolroom. And people like that learn from the people around them. If Douglass met you, he would figure out what he could learn from you, and he'd do that. And if he thought he'd used whatever he can learn from you, he'd discard you. It was one of the reasons he didn't keep good friendships very long. I can learn, what can I learn from you? Okay, I'm going to learn that, I'm done with you, and then go to the next person. He was a sponge. And then, of course, he learned from books. His book collection was over 4,000 volumes by late in his life. It's all in a warehouse in Landover, Maryland, the National Park Service runs. I got to go out there for an entire day, and I was hoping I was going to see all of his annotations in his books, you know, his underlinings and scribblings, which some of us do in our books. He didn't do much of that. Too bad. But he owned an amazing array of books. He owned individual volumes that were like interpreters' guides to the book of Isaiah, interpreters' guides to the book of Jeremiah. He had 3 entire collective works of Shakespeare, all the collected works of Dickens, all the collected works of Robert Burns, who was his favorite poet, and on and on and on and on and on. He was a reader. All right, last thought. The last line of his long-form masterpiece, the second autobiography called My Bondage and My Freedom, 1855, goes roughly like this. And remember when he's saying this. It's the middle of the 1850s. Bleeding Kansas has broken out in Kansas. The Republican Party's been born out of the crisis over the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850. There have been fugitive slave rescues going on throughout the early 1850s. Douglass has participated in some of them himself. By his count, he has helped approximately 100 fugitive slaves escape through Rochester, New York, up into Canada, just in these 5 years. Uncle Tom's Cabin came out and took the world, for better or worse, took the world by storm in 1852. The whole nation's in crisis over this, and he plants this long-form, politicized autobiography right in the midst of it, and it's sold like crazy. Sold 18,000 copies in the first edition. That's a good sale today. Talk to bookstore people.
Hey, do you see anything?
Got any books that have done 18,000 this month?
Notes. Do you see a piece?
Last line of the book. As long as heaven allows me to do this work, I will do it with my voice, my pen, and my vote.
Wow.
My voice, my pen, my vote. Now, the only weapons he ever had was voice and pen.
On the floor.
And now he's claiming the vote. And by and large, it's the only weapons any of us have. A voice, a pen, and most of us don't have the pen. We have a voice, a pen, and a vote. Thank you.
Great.
The Ram is going to clean up now all the bad stuff I did.
First of all, let's give David another warm round of applause. Thank you. Yeah. All right. Before we get into the discussion, I want to say a bit more about this bookstore and why your support for Revolution Books and your involvement in the life of this bookstore is so vital. Look, every day the injustices, the horrors, the enormities and atrocities multiply. They become more excruciating, more unconscionable. I mean, it was announced yesterday that the Trump regime may do a whole series of roundups. And there's talk of new detention centers, which can, yes, be described as concentration camps. That's what's in the offing. The new round of attacks on the right to abortion, the so-called heartbeat bill. You know, half of humanity, women, don't have control over their bodies. This is what we're confronting. The environmental crisis. People may have heard, seen that report on 1 million species are at peril right now. This is where this planet, this is where humanity is headed. New talk of threatened war against Iran. And this guy Trump has said if we have nuclear weapons, why can't they be used? Why do we have them? This is what we're confronting. And here at Revolution Books, we get into why, and why only a revolution can put an end to this. And why is a bookstore at the center of a political, intellectual, and cultural movement for an actual revolution? Why is this bookstore at the center of this movement for revolution? Well, fundamentally, it has everything to do with the fact that to change the world, to radically change the world, to profoundly change the world, we need to understand the world deeply and profoundly. And a hallmark of the new communism that has been brought forward by Bob Avakian and that animates the life of this bookstore is a thoroughly and consistently scientific approach to understanding the world, to engaging with the world, to discovering the patterns of development and the pathways to change. And you find that here at Revolution Books, and we apply that here at Revolution Books. And here you find books, authors who come like David, or last week David's colleague Jason Stanley wrote a book, How Fascism Works, and Andy Zio, our spokesperson, was in conversation with him. And what we do here is that we probe, we dig into these big questions and challenges that are confronting humanity. And we challenge people. Can you reform a system that has carried out genocide, in which the enslavement of black people led to segregation, to Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow of today? Can that be changed from within? Or is this baked into the very structure and history and functioning of this system? We get into that here. We get into literature, fiction, poetry, that tell the lives of people throughout the world. Literature that transports people to different places and to different points in time, that captures the longing and the aspirations of humanity. We get into that here because there's no revolution without the imagination and without the poetic spirit. And most of all, what you find here at Revolution Books is the way out of the madness, an actual strategy and plan and the vision to make a revolution, to overthrow this system when the conditions are right, and to bring into being a society and world in which human beings can truly flourish. And Bob Avakian has developed the new communism, which is the framework and the approach to make a truly liberatory revolution in today's world. And I really want to urge people, to discover Bob Avakian's leadership and his work, to dig into that, because what he has done is he's brought forth this new communism, and it conveys and it enables people to have a depth of understanding of why the world is the way it is and how it can be transformed radically through revolution to emancipate all of humanity. That's what this represents. And I really want to urge people to discover his leadership in this work. And you can find these books here, Basics, The New Communism. And actually, there's a wonderful opportunity coming up this Sunday. We're going to be showing the film at 4 o'clock, Why We Need an Actual Revolution, and how we can really make revolution. That's at 4 o'clock here. And Avakian not only brings a depth of understanding, but a passion to the question of why the world is the way it is and how it can be changed. And I just wanted, in connection with the discussion that we're having, to read this one statement from Bob. He says, "There is the potential for something of unprecedented beauty to arise out of unspeakable ugliness, Black people playing a crucial role in putting an end, at long last, to this system, which has for so long not just exploited, but dehumanized, terrorized, and tormented them in 1,000 ways, putting an end to this in the only way it can be done, by fighting to emancipate humanity, to put an end to the long night in which human society has been divided into masters and slaves, and the masses of humanity have been unleashed, beaten, raped, slaughtered, shackled, and shrouded in ignorance and misery." That's Bob Abakian on the oppression of Black people and the revolution that is needed to put an end to that, and which Black people will play a central role in. This is what we get into at this bookstore. This is why David's work is so important, because we're learning about the history. We get into the true history of Black people, of this country, what it was founded on, what makes it tick, the drive for profit, and all the forms of oppression that are built in to this system. We get into that when we debate it, and we bring forward this vision, which is not just an abstract ideal vision, but it's an actual scientific approach to understanding why we're in the state of the world and humanity and the planet itself that we are, and how things could be radically different. So that's why this bookstore is so important, because here you discover the way out of the madness. And I really want to call on all of you to consider making a donation or becoming a sustainer of this bookstore. I want to thank everyone who came in and donated money to the program, when you took your seats and got your, and got your literature. But we are nonprofit, all volunteer, and we can't survive without your involvement, your ideas, your energy, and your financial support. There are 3 things that people can do. One, I see a lot of new faces, as I said. Let your friends and colleagues know about Revolution Books. 2, you can become a sustainer. We have a sustainer program. And this is a way for people to make a monthly donation to become part of the life and the community of this bookstore. We want your ideas. And 3rd, you can volunteer. You can become an actual volunteer, people who help, staff and operate this bookstore. So these are 3 things that you can do. And I want Jane and Brenda to raise their hands, because they can tell you more about the Sustainer program. And you can tell them about at what level you might want a sustainer to make a donation. It really matters that we have a bookstore like Revolution Books. It really matters that we can have authors like David Blight come here, that we can have conversation, discussion, debate to get at the truth of things. And there's this urgency. This is an unprecedentedly dangerous situation that humanity faces, and yet there is a way out. So that's what I wanted to say about the bookstore. That's what I wanted to say about your coming to this event. And now what I want to say is, let's get the podium out of here and let's start the conversation, and we're going to draw you in. Okay? Thank you very much. Listen, on page 264, verse 2. Okay. I want to get to the role of words and playing a leadership role with those words, and the impact that this had on this crucial turning point in U.S. history. You state this: beneath these remembered yearnings, you're referring back to his Autobiographies, beneath these remembered yearnings lay the tremendous experience of a black abolitionist desperate for political strife that could forge revolutionary change. But in real time, how could a radical with a pen, a voice, and an individual vote ever bring this about? Did he simply await the moral logic and force of history, or did he act to try to force a cataclysm? I think it's a very pregnant passage that you've written there. And it's really getting at an important, I think a very important point in this life and work of Douglass, and a lesson that I think we should be, grappling with, and that is, as a writer, as an orator, as someone who wasn't simply outraged and outspoken, but who was trying to influence the course of history, who was responding to major turns and events. And underlying all this, underneath this, a volcano was brewing, if you will. What was bubbling up, there was a contradiction in American society that could no longer be contained. The clash between the slave system and the capitalist wage labor system, and the slaves who were waging rebellions, and the abolitionist movement that was spreading its influence, and this was coming to a head at all different levels of society. And the outcome of this was not preordained, that the Civil War would be waged. No. This is, you get into it.
Nothing was preordained.
Right, and I think this, and again, which sort of goes against the Bible as Bible in the religious sense, not in a literary metaphorical sense. Right. But my question to you is, how, in light of what you've written in that passage, what is the lesson here in terms of the role of ideas, how they take hold, how they mobilize people, how Douglass was looking at this and acting, and he was actually trying to act on history, as you said, not awaiting it, and he played a certain role in responding to these twists and turns. I just think this is a profound lesson for...
It's the central dilemma of this guy's life as a public thinker, a public person, a public actor. For example, let's just go back into the 1850s. Douglass is in his 30s, he turns 40 in the late 1850s. The American Union is on a road to disunion. We know that. They didn't. But the political culture is tearing itself apart. The political party system is tearing itself apart. The Whig Party dies in 1852. It's going to be replaced by the Republican Party. There's a string of anti-slavery parties. The old Liberty Party from way back in the 30s. There's the Free Soil Party of the late 1840s, early 1850s. Then there are these Republicans, which is this motley coalition of political forces who are mostly moderate anti-slavery people. Douglass, who again has only one weapon, he has a newspaper and he has his human voice, which he takes out on the road all the time, and sometimes got paid for his lectures and sometimes didn't. His newspaper is almost always dying. It can barely stay alive by its subscription rates, and he's always begging in his newspaper, just as you were, for his subscribers to pay up. He puts the list at the back of every issue of his paper of all those people who haven't paid up their subscription.
Right on.
And he still mails them the newspaper. He's trying to be the voice of, at the beginning of the 1850s, 3 million slaves. At the end of the 1850s, 4 million enslaved people are still in the South, and about 250 to 300,000 free blacks in the North, and another nearly 100,000 free blacks, actually 200,000 who live in the South. He's trying to be the voice of all of these people in a country that affords them absolutely no rights. And particularly in the wake of the Dred Scott decision, you should never forget what the Dred Scott decision actually said. It said, black people will never have a future in the United States with any kind of liberty or rights. The Dred Scott decision and the opinion written by Justice Taney said black people have no rights that white people need to acknowledge. To live in America and be a black person the day after the Dred Scott case in the spring of 1857, only 3 years out here from the Civil War, they don't know this yet, but to live in America after the Dred Scott case was to live in the land of the Dred Scott decision, which said black people have no future. Now, how do you sustain hope, activism, energy, belief, faith in making a life here? Some black activists and leaders, with some white allies, decided there is no future in America. Emigrate somewhere. Martin Delany, who had worked so closely with Douglass on the founding of his own newspaper back in the late 1840s, Delany decided to hell with America, at least for a while he did, and he imagined an emigration scheme to the Niger River Valley in West Africa, and he even went to what is modern-day Nigeria and traveled up the Niger River and was looking for some place to establish a colony for African Americans. That never was going to work at that time, but he tried. Henry Highland Garnet, the great Presbyterian preacher, himself a former fugitive slave from the eastern shore of Maryland, a friend of Douglass's, but also a rival of Douglass's. They often disagreed in lots of things. Garnet, after the Dred Scott case in the late 1850s, got involved in organizing yet another emigration scheme out of the country. His was called the African Civilization Society. Part of that was a Christian mission. Garnet was a minister. Part of that was Christian mission. They were going to go to Africa and Christianize the heathen. There were other immigration schemes. There were other people just decided there was an immigration scheme led by James Redpath and a bunch of other abolitionists to go to Haiti. And Douglass himself, in the spring of 1861, in the middle of the secession crisis, and again, it's worth pointing out here, Douglass is not inside of any circles of power yet. He's not communicating with anybody inside Abraham Lincoln's circle, or the circle of the Republican leadership, which is about to take over the federal government. With 7 states out of the Union, already seceded from the Union, Lincoln's about to be inaugurated. Douglass booked passage with his daughter, Rosetta, who was now like 21 or 22 years old. He booked passage to go visit Haiti, to check it out, to just see, to just go see Haiti. And he'd always had a fascination with Haiti because of Toussaint and the Haitian Revolution.
That's right.
He'd always had an interest in the first black republic in the Americas, and a revolution against slavery that actually worked and established a government and so on and so on. But he wanted to see, okay, if it ever really comes to this, is Haiti a place where I would move? Is Haiti a place I'd encourage my children to move? He had passage booked on a ship before Fort Sumter. And a day after the firing on Fort Sumter that started the Civil War, he wrote a little editorial that he put in his newspaper the next week, and it said, "Trip to Haiti canceled." Because now, who knows? The Civil War just broke out. Lincoln's calling for volunteers, and hundreds of thousands are volunteering. And there's about to be a war of some kind, which Douglass had been dreaming of, hoping for, begging for. This is the expectation you find, I guess, in that quote. That's a nice choice of that quote. That was well written, whoever wrote that. I like that passage.
How was it read out loud?
Damn good. Your interpretation was a little shaky, but no, I'm just kidding. No, but the greatest challenge to a Frederick Douglass and many others like him in that decade before the Civil War is, how do you sustain faith? How do you get up every day and believe there's a future in this country? Well, there were ways that he did sustain faith, and I analyze that at some length in the book. Part of it came out of his belief in the natural rights tradition, his unabiding, never failing belief in natural rights, that someday, somehow, this country, which established itself out of natural rights, established itself in the basic creeds of the natural rights tradition and the Declaration of Independence, would live up to it. Now, he loved the Declaration of Independence, by the way. He loved the creeds. He didn't necessarily love Jefferson, but he loved the creeds. The four first principles of the Declaration of Independence didn't belong to Jefferson. They didn't belong to anybody. They belonged to everybody. The doctrine of consent, the doctrine of popular sovereignty, which means that all power belongs with the people, the right to equality, and the right to revolution. Revolution Books. Those are the four first principles of the Declaration of Independence. Douglass called them precious ore. He said they're like precious ore from the ground. They're natural. And here's a country that says it was founded on it. It doesn't live up to it. Now, then comes the war. It was his fondest hope. And he didn't have this all figured out. He didn't necessarily predict exactly what's going to happen. He's not that kind of prophet. But his fondest hope is that somehow the American political system would tear itself apart over slavery's future, over slave labor versus free labor, over the power that slavery provided Southerners and the power that so many Northerners now did not want Southerners to have. His fondest hope is that there'd be some break, some reckoning of the American nation, such that the country would have to make war on slavery. Now, damned if that isn't what exactly came about. It took time. It took enormous bloodshed. None of it was predictable. None of it foreordained. But it came. It happened. And what does Douglass do? As soon as the war breaks out, as soon as it's clear that the northern states, the federal government, the United States, and don't forget, you know, Union soldiers in the Civil War wore a U.S. on their buckle. It was still the United States. And the Confederates wore a CSA. The United States was now going to have to make war on the South to bring them back into the Union. If that war lasts very long at all, anyone with one eye open knows it's also going to be a war on slavery. The question is how, when, by what means, by what legal strategies, by what military strategies. Douglass became immediately, when the war broke out, a war propagandist. You will never read more vicious war propaganda by an American than the stuff Douglass wrote in his newspaper and out on the stump as a speaker in 1861 and 1862. He was a vicious war propagandist. He invented stories about slaveholders. And he was creating the horrible Hun. He was creating gooks and horrible Huns and all the other things Americans have done in 20th century wars to inspire people to go south and slaughter slaveholders. That's exactly what he advocated. He said he advocated the death of, quote, death of every slaveholder in America. What had happened is there now was a sanctioned war to go kill slaveholders. And he didn't, moderate his language. And of course, in the book, if you're a biographer, you got to now explain, where does this venom come from in him? Well, go back to his youth. Go back to the rage he came out of slavery with. The war now made it legal and sanctioned to advocate going into the South and killing every Edward Covey in the South, who was the overseer who beat the hell out of Douglass for 1 year on the Eastern Shore. He said slaveholders were the enemy of humanity. It's ugly. I mean, war propaganda of that kind is always, it's vicious, it's horrible, it's ugly. You don't know where it's going to take people. But how do you change history with words? That was his dilemma. I remember once hearing Toni Morrison give a reading. It was right after Beloved came out. Most of you probably read Beloved. If you haven't, get it right now. Just get it. It was a reading. She was doing it at Harvard. I taught there 2 brief years, and she was doing this reading, a huge hall packed with students. And somebody asked Toni Morrison, ask something like, Miss Morrison, but you're only a writer. How can a writer change the world? You know, and it's a totally unfair question. She was very gentle. It was a student asking the question. I mean, tough question, but an interesting one. She said, I don't know, but it's what I do. And then somebody said, and the question also involved, maybe it was the second question, I've never forgotten this. Somebody asked her, so what's the meaning of that character you have there, beloved, this kind of ghost character in this book? What is the meaning of it? You know, it's like asking a painter to explain her painting. They don't do it. They tell you to look at the damn painting. Her answer was, well, I wanted the slaves to have a monument. We don't have any monuments. So I guess the book's a monument. I mean, she was being asked too much. We write because it's one thing we know how to do. We write because we have something to say. We write because we do want readers. We write because we do want to change something. We write history because it is so deeply involved with the present. Present and past are always just mixed together every day in every way. I mean, you walk out into the street, the present and the past are right there. They're right there. They're always there. And everybody walking on Malcolm X Boulevard, on 132nd Street, over on Adam Clayton Powell, and on Frederick D. Boulevard, everyone walking on the street has a sense of history in their head of some kind. Everyone does. How they got it's another matter. And they might have got it from home, they might have got it from church, they might have got it, maybe they got it from school, maybe they got it from reading. Good God, imagine that. And maybe they got it from popular culture, maybe they got it from films, maybe they got it from just the storyteller on the corner, maybe they got it from grandma. But they got some sense of the past in their head. Our job is to make that past in their heads better, fuller, if you like, truer, deeper, and troubled. So a Douglass there in the 19th century wasn't any different than Toni Morrison. He's trying to change the world with words, but it's all he's got. But he had a lot of words. And in that newspaper, and with that voice, you know, it got him invited to the White House to talk to Lincoln. When Lincoln desperately needed the most important black spokesman in the country to come talk to him in August of 1864, when Lincoln believed he might not be reelected that fall and he wanted Douglass to help him set up a system, this was incredible. He invited Douglass in August of 1864 to the White House to ask Frederick Douglass to help him organize a system that would funnel as many slaves as possible out of the Upper South behind Union lines to legal freedom before Election Day in November, in case Lincoln lost the election to George McClellan and the Democrats, because if the Democrats won, there was probably going to be a negotiated peace, and nobody quite knew what would happen to the legality of slavery. Suddenly, that was the closest to real power Douglass may have ever been. And Lincoln needed him all of a sudden. But, you know, we are talking about how do you change the world with words. And you see, Douglass never believed that an all-out collective, some kind of violent revolution or slave insurrection was ever going to be the answer, because he understood history and he'd seen this. Slave insurrections meant a lot of dead slaves, a lot of dead black people, and a lot of bad results. He'd read about Nat Turner's insurrection. He considered Nat Turner a hero, but a very dead one. And it's the reason he didn't join John Brown when he found out what John Brown was really about to do at the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, the largest arsenal in the United States. He knew it was a suicide mission. And Douglass wasn't interested in being a martyr. He was interested in living to try to change the place. But he knew what to do with a martyr once he was dead. Because once John Brown was dead, Douglass eulogized him the rest of Douglass's life. He said over and over in different ways, John Brown was far more valuable on the gallows and dead than he ever was alive. And there should be a few John Browns in history, but not too many of them. If we all become John Brown or we all become Nat Turner, we will all be dead or on the gallows. You see, back to Raymond's question, the choice that Douglass faces there in the 1850s in this road to civil war is, if you can't find a way within politics to make this happen, what is your choice? Leaving or insurrection? They're not good choices. And it's one of the most fascinating things about Frederick Douglass to me has always been that process by which he evolves. And I just spent a piece of today up at Yale meeting with 10 or a dozen high school students whose teacher brought them to, they're reading my book, this group of high school kids, and he brought them, I spent 2 hours with them, and they wanted to talk about how Douglass went from being this moral suasionist of the 1840s into this political abolitionist of the 1850s. It was great, because that process was Douglass becoming a political pragmatist. Not just a survivor, not just a moderate. He was never moderate about anything, except booze, maybe. He didn't drink a lot. His wife wouldn't let him. But he learned how politics works. He had to learn what power was. He had to learn that some politicians are despicable. They're awful. They don't really want to do things for you, but they can be made to do some things that can serve you. And you don't have to like them. You don't have to get kind of down with them. You just have to make them do something in their interest that is in your interest. That's politics. And Douglass had a hard time with that in the 1850s for a while. He had a hard time shouldering up to the Republican Party. They were just too milquetoast for him at first, or so it seemed, until he met a few who were genuine radicals, like Charles Sumner and a few others. And he has a very difficult time with Abraham Lincoln at first, until Lincoln grew. In fact, Lincoln had no more vicious critic in the first year of the Civil War than Douglass. At one point, Douglass in late 1861 called Lincoln the most powerful slave catcher in America. Whoa. Changed his tune after the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and especially the final proclamation. He learned something about Lincoln, partly by meeting him, but partly by reading him, that this was somebody who actually did have a moral core. Some politicians don't. Some do. And if you found one that had a moral core, he'd try to work with it. It doesn't mean that Douglass always knew where he was going with any of this. He kind of made it up as he went. But he learned politics. He learned the pragmatism of politics. He learned that coalitions is how change comes about. And we may not like that. You know, how many times in your own life, whatever age any of us are, how many times in your own lifetime have you preferred that candidate and held your nose to vote for that one? Or maybe you've never held your nose to vote that way. You're lucky if you haven't. I've only thrown my vote away, truly thrown my vote away once. I mean, I really threw it like way over the right field roof. And I vowed never to do it again. It was in 1980. I was in graduate school in Madison, Wisconsin, the second most radical place in America, we always said. We're number 2. Berkeley was supposed to be number 1. But we always, you know, I was in grad school, I was in Madison. We didn't believe Reagan could be elected. It was stupid. Reagan, he can't get elected. George W. Bush, he can't get elected. Trump, he can't get elected. Well, I somehow thought Jimmy Carter would still win, but I was so pissed off at Carter I voted for Barry Commoner, the environmental candidate. Anybody remember Barry Commoner? He got about 2%, or 0.2% of the vote or something. I mean, that's throwing your vote away so far, you have to ruin your arm to throw it. And I vowed never again. I'm not going to throw it away again. In Reaganism, I said, I'm not doing this again. Douglass wanted to vote for something that would end slavery. It took him a while to realize the Republicans had now the possibility of doing this, especially once the war came. So how do you sustain hope? How do you imagine changing the world with words? For one thing, and if Douglass were here, I don't know what he would say. I get asked this all the time. What would Douglass think about this and think about that? And it used to be possible. We're living in a different moment now, as you said. It used to be, as a historian, you could just say, we don't do that. We don't play counterfactuals. That's not our business. But that's not acceptable anymore. So if Douglass was here, I know one thing he would say. He'd say, keep a long view. Hard as it is, keep a long view of history. There were so many times in the story of abolitionism and on the road to Civil War, and then after the Civil War, when seemingly the victory was won and codified in those great constitutional amendments, and then Reconstruction began to fade, erode, retreat, fall apart, and was defeated. And then in the South, terror took over. He would tell us, hey, there were so many ups and downs and peaks and valleys in the story that I lived. Keep a long view. Hard as it is. And if you're young, it's hard to keep a long view because you don't have a long view. And if you do have a pen, write. You all have a voice, and you all have, well, hopefully you all have a vote, depending on what state you live in and whether the voter suppression laws are succeeding or not. Anybody else? Sure. Let's go to the back.
Well, I just want.
Go ahead, Harold.
Okay. Look, I think we're gonna open it up to the audience because you've said quite a bit that we can chew on and respond to, and I want to come back to some of the points that you raised. I just want to, just before we get into the Q&A with the audience, one, I mean, it's important that slavery was ended through a war. Mm-hmm. It wasn't ended. It was. Absolutely. He was an advocate of collective violence in that sense.
Oh yeah.
Right. So one, it took a war. It took a war to end slavery. Second, the Union was founded on this compromise with slavery.
Oh yeah.
Right? The Constitution, inscribed slavery, into the functioning of this society, the different elements of the Constitution, the 3/5 clause, the Fugitive Slave Clause, even delaying the termination of the international slave trade.
Right.
The Declaration of Independence, is talking about slave insurrections. So these are things that we need to explore and probe about the founding, the character and the nature of this thing, right? And so I think what we want to do now is let I want to bring the audience in, comments from people, questions, and then I want to return, to some of this. So
I saw a hand right in the back. Yes, sir.
Go.
Wait for the mic.
We're going to wait for the mic.
Oh, the mic. Okay. Right back there. Go ahead.
Okay, I just want to remind David that I'm still recommending his book, Race and Memory, from New Paltz when we had him there. When he was at Michigan State. You should read that book, Race and Remember. My issue is with Douglass is that I guess in order to do what he did, he seemed to negate or cast away people who could have helped him, such as Dr. Martin Delaney, the first black to go to Harvard Medical School. Yeah. He could have been a better help than he didn't utilize him. And I guess Garrison, I still have difficulty with him breaking with Garrison and losing contact with Garrison. And Garrison, however different, got him started.
He did.
And thirdly, there were people in my hometown of Philadelphia when he spoke at Mother Bethel AME Church.
Right.
That was another group that could have been a larger group that could have got on board with what he had to say. Thank you.
So I'll just quickly respond that He and Delaney were very close in the late 1840s. Delaney helped him create his newspaper. Delaney was the traveling agent of the North Star, wandering all over the North, trying to help forge free black communities. Douglass was editing the paper. But he and Delaney broke up in part because Delaney didn't want to work with Douglass. And Delaney was not very good at cooperating. Let's just put it that way. They had a falling out. Now, the Garrison breakup has to do with all kinds of things, ideological, strategic, and personal. And it is true that after they broke up in the early 50s, he and Garrison never made up. As for the black church, Douglass spoke in damn near every black church in this country. He did make good use, actually, of Mother Bethel, and particularly the AME system, the AME Zion and AME system. He was an AME preacher in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and he spoke regularly in Rochester at an AME church there called Spring Street AME. So he was deeply, and then later in his life in Washington, he was a member and had a pew at Metropolitan AME. So he is deeply tied to the AME church. It doesn't mean he always agreed with some of the bishops, like Henry McNeil Turner and a few others. He might have made more use of the Christian Recorder, their newspaper, but he sometimes, I think, saw that as a rival. And make no mistake here, this is a world full of rivalries, just like today. And Douglass had lots of trouble, particularly with the younger generation of male black leaders in the late 19th century who were trying to knock him off. That is, move him out of the way, and he didn't like being knocked off. It doesn't mean that he was always right either. He was dead wrong on the Kansas Exodus, for example, and pretty much alone on that story. By the way, to Harold Raymond's point, in 1869, at the last meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society, this old organization formed in the 1830s, it's Garrison's old anti-slavery organization, they were deciding to finally disband after the passage of the 15th Amendment, the Voting Rights Amendment.
I don't know.
13th was passed, 14th was passed in 67, 15th Amendment in 1869. They hold what they say is the last gathering of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Douglass is a major speaker at that. It's in New York. And in that speech, he pleaded with his fellow abolitionists, 4 years after the war, don't give up this organization. He said, don't stop this organization. We still need an anti-slavery organization. And then, once again, he found a metaphor. He said, the problem is slavery did not die honestly. That's your point. It didn't die. He said it didn't die. It didn't die because Americans got up one day and held a referendum and voted and said, well, let's end slavery. It's not the way it happened. It happened in a bloodbath. It happened in the largest war ever fought in modern history to that time. It left the country with an enormous problem of mourning the dead. And he said it didn't die honestly. And for that reason, it's not dead. And pro-slavery ideas are not dead. The American Anti-Slavery Society was disbanded.
That was?
One point he wanted to renounce God, and Sojourner Truth had to correct him. But she said, is God dead?
Is God dead? He wasn't really denouncing God. But he had problems with the Sojourner Truth too. I think she was just too big a voice for him. Douglass had a hard time making male friendships. He was much better at making female friendships because they were rarely his rivals. The Sojourner was a rival.
Let's bring David. Let me see a show of hands. I just want to see how many people would like to ask questions, make some points, because we want to have time for people to talk informally with David and get the book and sign the book, and I just want to see a show of hands because 1, 2, 3. Okay, I want to take
Take your questions.
Yeah, I just want to. So let's take. Will everyone stay for these 3 to 4 questions to hear David on this and stay behind with the book? Okay, because I want to. Okay, so make your question.
Let's put on the spot with
let's get to them. Okay, because. We're going to lock the doors, okay? All right. So let's go. You had your hand up quickly.
Hi, David. My name is Joe McNally, and I'm also an author, too. I really connected with what you were saying about the prophet. Also, I want to congratulate you on the book and how you use imagery to put us in the scene. I think that's very important. You are really a writer. And it shows. But my question to you is, in wake of everything we're talking about and Frederick Douglass's, struggles and things like that. And I know you said people ask you all the time, what would Frederick Douglass do? But like in terms of like the political climate we find ourselves in, right? Like this is what he was fighting for, to have anti-slavery. But we are experiencing slavery in a different form today, if we would all agree, right? Mass incarceration, the 13th Amendment,
Human
police
trafficking.
brutality, human trafficking, immigration, all this other stuff. In your mind, as someone who studies Frederick Douglass as a historian, what do you think Frederick Douglass's mind would be in this time right now? What would he be saying? What would he be, we can't really know for sure, but
Okay.
you probably, what would he be doing,
You're true. You're right. I don't know, but he'd tell stories. He wouldn't tell us what to do. He'd tell stories. He'd probably go back and he'd say, well, in 1856, we were faced with this, and we were trying to do this and this and that. Or right after the Dred Scott decision, let me tell you about despair. He'd go back to his own experience. That's what most of us do. He'd go back to his own incredible experiences, and he'd say, well, we had a right to give up in whatever, 1847, 1852. He might even talk about some of the fugitive slave crisis. After the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, waves of African Americans left to go to Canada. Just fled the country. We estimate around 20,000 people left the northern states to move into Canada between 1850 and 1855. It was an exodus. People were frightened to death, whether they were fugitives or not. Even free blacks who had legal freedom, frightened now that this new law could re-enslave everybody. So he'd probably just tell us stories as a way of trying to help us keep a long view.
And then
But he'd probably try. One of his most famous
Other people.
one of his most famous quotes is the one about power.
Okay, we're gonna.
Who knows it?
Okay, who are those other hands that
Power never concedes anything without.
Okay, we're going to do three other. We're going to do you, and then the Sansara, and then you on the end there. Okay, so we're going to do those three. Huh?
Go ahead.
So okay, let's go.
So just two quick questions. Do you have any evidence of the psychological impact on his life after losing his mother so young? And then second question, was there any evidence or attempt by him to teach the first wife how to read?
Okay. Take the second question first. Yes. They tried many tutors, many attempts or efforts to help Anna learn to read. First of all, she did count. She kept account books. She kept her bank book. She was very good at that, which is interesting. Their daughter Rosetta tutored her mother. They hired tutors. Julia Griffiths, his Englishwoman friend, who came and stayed 6 years in Rochester and helped him edit the newspaper. Julia was enlisted to help Anna learn, but Anna never did. No one knows for sure why. Everyone's had a theory: dyslexia, resistance to his world. Who knows? Psychological impact of losing his mother. Nothing about that can be proved, like so much psychological analysis. But there are any number of times in his life when you can see him, hear him in his words, yearning for parents, yearning for a sense of home, yearning for a maternal nurturing and help. There are many women friends he makes in his life, and no, they're not all, romantic relationships by any means. but he made friendships with women much more easily than men, in my view. Lots of British women he made good friends with in his 18 months over there, who became fundraisers for his newspaper, fundraisers for his family. And he seemed to have an ease around women, usually white women, because that's who he's meeting in the reform world. Although, you know, he had some adoptive siblings. One was named Eliza, a black woman he meets in Philadelphia in 1843, who is a fugitive slave. She's an escaped slave, scared out of her shoes. She comes to a Douglass speech. They meet. Turns out she's from Talbot County, Maryland. She's from the same county he's from. Who's your people? Who's your people? They knew each other's cousins. She came and lived with the Douglasses. First in Lynn, Massachusetts, which was where he lived in those first years. And she became a very close companion to Anna. And she was literate. And when Douglass is in England, he writes letters to this Eliza, or is it Harriet? No, Eliza, who actually, she had two different first names, depending on when you find her. He writes letters to her as a way of communicating with his wife, Anna. And then he took a real paternal attitude toward her. This was less mother than it was sister or daughter. She wasn't much younger than him. He's writing to her when he's in England and he's lonely and he's troubled and he wants to know how the children are and on and on and on. And this woman tells him that she's met some guy and she wants to get married. And Douglass goes ballistic. He says, "How could you dare do this without asking me?" Like, who's he? You know, so he's preaching at this woman, "Don't you dare marry some..." Oh, and she wanted to marry a guy who was a fugitive slave. And he says, "Why would you marry a fugitive slave?" Well, Fred. But so he has these endearing relationships with women. And I think you got to read into that at times, that he never had any nurturing except up to maybe the age of 5 from his grandmother. And after that, nobody.
Okay, we want 2 more questions. No? Okay. The last one over here, I saw you with your hand up. Yeah, great. This will be the last one, and then we'll have book signing, and people who didn't have the chance to ask a question can do it one-on-one with David, okay?
I wanted to ask about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, their encounters, and maybe his admiration for Ida B. Wells.
Oh, good. Great. There were some encounters with Harriet Tubman. There's also some correspondence, a couple letters back and forth. One of them a beautiful, admiring letter by Douglass to Harriet. They didn't have a lot of close associations. In some ways, one might think they should have. They're both from Maryland. She from Dorchester County, he from Talbot. Up at the Harriet Tubman sites up in upstate New York, they're trying to make more of that relationship than may have actually been there. But Ida B. Wells, tremendous friendship. Ida B. Wells was very young when she first meets Douglass, and he was an old man. He had like a fatherly, almost grandfatherly relationship with her. He meets her right after she has left Memphis, in the lynching crisis. He reads her in national newspapers. There's this woman from Mississippi and Memphis who is just lambasting the country on lynching, and he thought, oh my God, what a voice. And they met. She ended up coming to Cedar Hill and spending weeks. She actually became very close friends with Helen Pitts, his second wife. And she actually was a big defender of the Douglasses' marriage. Then he helps fund her when Ida goes to England on a speaking tour. Douglass helped her make contacts with networking, with people and so on, and even with a little bit of money. Now, but Ida was a little bit like him when he was young. She didn't stay under anybody's tent for very long. She was more than feisty. She was brilliant. And she also, though, was struggling. She was alone when she toured England. And she wrote a few despairing letters to Frederick, and he got really worried about her. He got very paternal about her. Like, you better come home here, And then, of course, and I'll end with this, they had a very tight and, in some ways, very testy relationship during the Chicago World's Fair. In 1893, when Douglass was the representative of the nation of Haiti, African Americans had no pavilion at that World's Fair. African Americans were nowhere represented at that World's Fair except as the original Aunt Jemima was represented making pancakes. It was horrible the way black people were presented. And Douglass was there to represent the nation of Haiti.
Right.
And he and Ida Wells got together to co-author a pamphlet, a little 40-page pamphlet called Why the Negro is Not at the Columbian Exposition. They wrote that together, they published it together, and in the last 2 months of the World's Fair, Frederick Douglass stood at the Haitian Pavilion every day handing out that pamphlet. And Ida kind of prodded him to write it. Plus, he didn't need Ida Wells to convince him that he better get out there speaking on lynching. He was already ready to do that. But she was part of the influence, part of the prodding. And it was in Chicago, during the Chicago World's Fair, that Douglass first crafted the first version of the last great speech of his life. And Ida had a hand in that. It's the speech called Lessons of the Hour, which is his 3-part analysis of why lynching was happening in the United States, and it's a brilliant speech.
Yeah.
And after the World's Fair, he took that speech on the road. He's 76 years old.
Right.
He took that baby on the road and gave it dozens and dozens of times all over the country. To his dying day, he had a very close correspondence and relationship with Ida Wells, and when he died, Ida went to pieces. I mean, we know that from her own autobiography.
Okay, well, thanks for asking that question. Thank all of you for coming out and being part of this program. And let's all thank David for writing this book, for presenting it to us here at Revolution Books.